Hi, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello, fantasy fiction fans. Well, we managed to get to the end of June, end of the 6th month of 2020, and towards the end of 2019, I covered what is a wizard, and I covered what is a warlock, and I promised I'd cover what is a witch in 2020, and it's taken us this long to get to the definition of a witch, so I do apologise for that. So I better do that quickly before we get into the second half of the year. So the Middle English word witch, which is wicche, W-I-C-C-H-E, wicche, did not distinguish between female and male genders. Well, a witch is a supporter, a defender, an advocate, a follower and a disciple of wicca, W-I-C-C-A. And you'll notice there that wicca, W-I-C-C-A, sounds a bit like the Middle English word wicca, which, that's because both of those words have the same root. And you'll also notice that a person doesn't have to be adept to be a witch. Merely speaking in favour of wicca would identify the supporter as a witch, W-I-C-C-H-E. Once you get your head around that very loose definition, you can see why so many people were implicated and accused in and of witchcraft during the witch trials. And it also explains why somebody like Hagrid, for example, is a witch. He may not actually even be able to use magic for all we know, but he's certainly a supporter, a defender, an advocate, a follower, and a disciple of Wicca. A person of otherwise good character might be denounced and even condemned for witchcraft just because they defend Wicca. And they don't have to actually practice Wicca, as I've demonstrated there, to be a witch, merely to support it. So what is Wicca? Well, Wicca is the oldest of all human religions and probably goes back to the hunter-gatherer societies of the Paleolithic period in human history. In other words, the Old Stone Age. So this is the period before Stonehenge. Paleolithic people hunted wild animals for meat, and they used animal bones for tools and animal products for clothing and equipment, and they gathered berries and shells and fungus, and they found stones for tools and wood for their fires and other natural materials that they needed to construct shelters and make clothes with and make their art. And hunter-gatherers adopted a nomadic lifestyle because they needed to follow the herds. They needed to go to the next place where they might find a harvest. For example, they might want to walk to the place where there will be a windfall of apples. Or they may want to walk to the place where they know that seashells wash up on the beach regularly. And this meant they needed to become very knowledgeable and proficient at nature, especially at weather forecasting, and they had to have a kind of close relationship with their physical environment, and they needed a good understanding of the complex interactions that exist between living organisms, and that's so that they could exploit the natural food chain. These people became experts at identifying and understanding plants and animals, and they knew better than you and I ever will about the subtle balances of the universe and the life cycles of all things. These Paleolithic people integrated into a self-sustaining natural ecosystem. They didn't distance themselves from nature and the natural earth in the same way that we and all of their successors have done. The Paleolithic people were integral, interdependent and symbiotic with what Chief Seattle later described as the web of life. These people understood they were just one thread within a giant weave of nature. They accumulated a wealth of knowledge about the natural world. They assimilated this over many generations and they passed it down to their heirs word of mouth. This knowledge, this secret knowledge, might have made all the difference between life and death for a family or for a tribe. Knowledge of nature was crucial to survival. Much wisdom could be passed father to son or mother to daughter, but more specialised awareness might have been kept undisclosed or only shared within a few people. And that's because you wouldn't want a rival tribe or an opposing family to get to, for example, a berry harvest before you and take all the spring greens before your tribe arrived, or rob the bees of their honey just at the appropriate time. So as knowledge of the natural world became very precious, some of it, not all, but some of it became obscure until this murky and this cryptic knowledge, which is known as the arcane, A-R-C-A-N-E, became trusted to only a handful of individuals. And these individual truth keepers were the only ones deemed trustworthy enough to keep and impart the most mysterious confidences of the tribe. And these were the first adepts, A-D-E-P-T-S. It couldn't have taken long for these early societies to become fixated by aspects of fertility. The fertility of their own families and their own tribes, of course, but also the fertility of all other living organisms, and especially the living organisms upon which they depended to sustain life. It was also easy to become infatuated by some of the improbabilities and coincidences and paradoxes that nature, or Mother Nature, seems to throw up. And anybody would be fascinated by these improbabilities and these coincidences, but especially these people, because they, don't forget, are part of the natural weave of life. So they are even more determined to learn nature's secrets. And these ideas, both these ideas, Mother Nature's secrets and fertility, became personified, in other words, incarnated, within two divinities who began to be worshipped by these tribes. Maybe because it was thought that these divinities controlled some aspects of the web of life. These personifications were extremely basic, and they were this: a male spirit of fertility and a female spirit of earthly motherhood. Now, it's possible that the Paleolithic people also perceived some kind of supreme cosmic power, some kind of creator sky god, who was the primary cause and the primary mover of all things. They found wholeness and orderliness around them in nature, so it's likely they thought that this balance, what we might call the finely balanced machinery of the universe, was the work of one single binding unit that might be represented by a distant yet supreme power who stayed in heaven. But we guess that they thought this supreme spirit was so impossibly remote and inaccessible that it was not worth the bother. Now, you've got to get into the mindset of the nomadic Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. A nomadic hunter-gatherer society would have thought in conceptual terms of how easy it is to travel to some place. And if it's easy to travel towards an objective, say for example it's easy to travel towards the cliffs where you might find some eggs that have been laid by seabirds, then if it's easy to get there, then you can get there. If it's very difficult to get there, then it's not worth getting there. This is their conceptual vagueness. So if it was deemed impossible to get somewhere, if it wasn't worth the journey, then there's no point in going. So that's why we think that although they may well have understood the general concept of a creator sky god, it wasn't worth going to, because the concept of a supreme power which stayed in heaven is too far away. But what they did like was this understanding, this very easy understanding of the personifications of a male spirit of fertility and a female spirit of earthly motherhood. It's called a duotheistic idea. It means male-female spirit deity structure. And the male-female spirit deity structure they adopted was the horned god and the mother goddess. Now, I'm like you, and I agree that the horned god does sound a little bit scary, but really he isn't. The horned god has twin horns on his head, and the people who lived at this period were hunting animals which had two horns on their head, either two antlers or two horns. And the animals they were hunting were very strong, and they provided them with everything they needed to live. So the two horns was a symbol they understood very well, but the horned god is also a personification of a twofold aspect of earthly existence. The horned god is a personification of night and day, of darkness and light, of death and life, of winter and summer, of birth and rebirth. The horned god's horns symbolise, in part, this dualistic nature, but he is also the rampant personification of virility. One of the oldest representations we have of him is the antlered figure of Cernunnos, and this was discovered on the Gundenstrup cauldron, which is a decorated silver vessel, probably a religious silver vessel, thought to date from about 200 BC. And although this cauldron was found in Denmark, it's likely to be of Thracian origin, and that's the area where we find modern-day Turkey today. We think it's Thracian because we know that Thracians were skilled silver workers. Now, perhaps the icons on this amazing vessel represent the Celtic pantheon. Well, I covered the word pantheon in an earlier podcast. It's not clear that it is the Celtic pantheon. The jury is still out on that, but one image we can recognise on this silver vessel is Cernunnos, the horned god. And the reason we know it's him is because he is shown in other reliefs and in other artworks that we found. On the silver vessel, he's seated with a torque, T-O-R-Q-U-E, in one hand and another around his neck, and he is surrounded by animals and plants and leaves, and he holds, in other words, he controls a snake, and the twin antlers on his head reach heavenward. In 1961, the English archaeologist James Mellart made an amazing discovery whilst excavating at a very large Neolithic settlement in the Anatolian Peninsula, which, funny enough, is in present-day Turkey, near where the Gundenstrup cauldron was made by the Thracians, in a place that I think is pronounced Kataloihuk. Now, he found there a fat, nude female form portrayed in the actual moment of giving birth, whilst settled on a throne. On one side of her is a lioness, and on the other side is a panther, and this demonstrates to any beholder that this female figure is the master of animals. The Neolithic sculpture was fabricated from baked clay, and the astonishing thing about the sculpture is it's 8,000 years old. So this was created when the world was populated by scattered Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. And this fat, nude female is one of the oldest known representations of the mother goddess. The woman on the pottery throne is not particularly glamorous or even very pleasant to look at. And that might be because she's a maiden, but she's also a mother and a crone, all rolled into one. She's Mother Earth, Mother Nature, and the creatress of all life. And because of all these things, she's associated with the full moon and the stars and the earth and the sea. So that's Wicca, W-I-C-C-A. It's the study of nature. It's an ancient belief about a horned god and a mother goddess, and it's about interpreting the natural world and the rhythms and the cycles of the world to get a better understanding of how they affect mankind. Wicca incorporates the practice of magic, and I've discussed this in the past. The magic is the hidden sympathies between objects that allow one object to influence another, and these were cryptic secrets that only a few in a society would learn. Remember, the adepts. But Wicca is more than just that. It also became a quasi-religion and was a way of life for its adherents and its followers. Well, earlier this year we discussed the Roman invasion of Europe, and when the Romans began their expansion across Europe and across Africa and across the Middle East, they were still very superstitious people with their own ideas about magic and their own pantheon of gods. But early Christians, which were also Romans, don't forget, began to refer to the diverse array of cults that they found around them as pagans. And pagans just means, pejoratively, it means rural or rustic. The connotation was that a rural person, a rural people, adopted a lesser religion than the people who lived in the city. They adopted a religion of the peasants. As Christianity spread out across Roman controlled Europe, it was found that people of towns and cities were converted more readily than the people in rural areas. So it soon became an insult to be considered a pagan. If you were called a pagan, it was like being called an unenlightened bumpkin. The Christian evangelization of Europe was soon so escapable and so compelling that almost all the population were converted to the notion of one God, to be found through Jesus Christ the Saviour. This meant that only the most isolated and marginal communities held on to their pagan beliefs of Wiccan magic and the horned god and the mother goddess concept. Worse still, for those few surviving believers, they were hunted down by the do-gooding evangelists who assumed that it was God's work to go across and save their souls. So the remaining few who believed in Wiccan magic and horned god and mother goddess, they went undercover. They kept their secrets very confidential. They hid their beliefs and they ensured that all of their meetings were very clandestine. And of course, this underground and this shadowy behaviour made the pagans seem even more suspicious than they already were. And I suppose at the same time, these beliefs that they had became attractive to the city dwellers because they were romanticised. So the city dwellers started to romanticise the belief systems of the pagan people. Anyway, the end result is that mistrust soon begot mistrust, and so the church authorities began to persecute anybody who was an unbeliever or anybody who was a supporter of the unbelievers. And the authorities of those days, all the way through to the 17th and even the 18th century, started to accuse pagans of being a bit dodgy. Or, that's at the better end, or the worse end, they accused them of being sinister. So those that believed in Wicca were driven underground, and to be a supporter or a defender or an advocate or follower or disciple of Wicca was to commit an offence against God and against man. So we're getting closer to what a witch is. The Hungarian folklorist Eva Porks suggests that accusations of witchcraft normally fell into 4 categories. And I'll go through those with you. a person is caught in the act of sorcery. A well-meaning healer has lost the trust of their clients. An innocent person was disliked by their neighbours, or a person has the reputation of being witch-like. As you can imagine, that means that a lot of blameless people have been accused or were accused of witchcraft, and even if they were exculpated, which would be an unlikely outcome by the way, they'd still suffer from the whiff of censure for the rest of their days. And that's why we still call mob vilification and sensationalist mudslinging witch hunting. You've heard the term. And that's because so many innocent people are accused, and even if they're acquitted and exonerated, their vilification goes on forever. The folklorist Eva Pox also identified 3 types of witch: the neighbourhood witch, the professional healer, sorcerer, seer or midwife. This type of witch earns a living through sorcery, and the supernatural witch, who is perhaps a bit like the succubus. This witch might make themselves known during episodes of either sleep paralysis or in visions or in dreams. You don't have to be much of a logical thinker to think about those 3 types of witch and work out that type 3, the supernatural witch, would be very hard to find and certainly would be extremely hard to prosecute. Type 2, which is the professional healer and the midwife, provides a service of sorts to the community. So unless they lost the trust of their clients, then it makes sense that the authorities would move their investigations elsewhere. And the ones that they would turn to for their investigations and their identifications and their unvanning, ones they would turn to for the witch hunting would be the neighbourhood witches, Group 1. And most of those allegations were connected with petty jealousies and local disputes and conflicts over things like property and inheritances. So a witch really is either a person who's been wrongly accused or supporter of Wicca, a professional healer, a sorcerer, a seer or midwife who earns a living through their sorcery, and that's the ones that Harry Potter fall into, or a supernatural witch, which is a creature which comes out of some other world and visits you during your sleep or in visions and in dreams. It's sobering to reflect that witches are still hunted even now in the 21st century. It's estimated in Tanzania, East Africa, about 500 women are murdered each year following accusations of witchcraft. And of course, all of those accusations are about people in Group 1, the neighbourhood witch. And state-sanctioned witch hunts also still go on in some jurisdictions. For example, in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabians have executed people for practising witchcraft and sorcery in 2011, 2012 and 2014.